you very much. Thank you, Bill. Before I begin, I wanted to say something for those of you who were with us last week for the violin demonstration. Quite remarkable news story in the New York Times this morning, and it was on NPR, about the finding of one of the most important missing Stradivarius violins in the world. This is the Ames Stradivarius. It's been missing, I think, for 30 years, and it was stolen from the great violinist and Aspen favorite, Roman Totenberg. Many of you will remember Roman. I like the story that Kay and Matthew Buxbaum, when they first came to Aspen in 1953, the first concert they heard was a Bartók concerto played by Roman Totenberg. In any case, Roman had this very important violin. It was stolen from his office in Boston, Cambridge, actually, and he thought he knew who had taken it, but he had no proof. And all these years later, it turns out he was right. And the heir of the person who took it tried to sell it. And it's now restored to Roman's family. So that is in the Times today if you want to look at it. Today, we have an extraordinary scientist whom I will introduce in a moment. We also have three wonderful musicians who come to you from the Aspen Music Festival and School. And I wanted to tell you what we're going to do. We're going to open with a brief excerpt from Beethoven's Violin Concerto. Don't be alarmed, it is only an excerpt. But Dr. Zatori wished particularly to have some Beethoven to open. And Kevin Lin, a student this summer with us, and Tamara Goldstein, who is on our staff as a pianist, will be playing that. And then at the conclusion of the talk, which should be about 45 minutes, Dr. Zatori has asked for a particular piece of Brahms, and pianist Peng Lin is going to play that. She is also a student with us this summer. After that, there will be a chance for questions and answers. So roughly an hour of program, questions and answers after that. So, Dr. Robert Zatori is one of the most eminent neuroscientists in the world. He is at the Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University. The institute combines research work with clinical practice in neuroscience. Dr. Zatori's work has particular importance for music and the way music is processed in the brain, and he will, of course, cover that. I was thinking, I'm going to make this introduction as brief as possible so you can hear as much of Dr. Zatori as possible. But when we have presented before, which we have done, it has been to conferences of neuroscientists. So this is a bit of a flip, and it is an immense pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Robert Zatori.
Thank you very much. It's such a great pleasure to be back in Aspen, and I really want to thank Alan and all the organizers for this spectacular opportunity. And I'm delighted to see that there are so many of you here. I think we should get underway with the music right away. So if Kevin, where are you? Ah, here we go. So please welcome our soloists. Thank you so very much. That was nice. I really think maybe, next time we'll just have them play the whole concerto and forget the lecture. Can everybody hear me if I stand here? Is that good? Great. So it will become clear in a few moments why I asked to have a little bit of Beethoven and why having a little violin. Part of it is simply to get you in the correct mood so that you'll be appreciating ideas about music. But I have some specific reasons for it as well. But before we get there, I want to kind of back up a little bit to the very beginning. If we can go to the first slide. And we're doing something a little strange here with two computers because we couldn't quite get them to communicate correctly. So I want to go back to really some very ancient music that we now know exists. So these flutes you see on the screen were actually found in a cave in China, and they were made from the leg bones of wading birds. And they're about 6,000 years old, and they have the distinction of being the oldest playable musical instruments that still exist. And I actually have a recording here. Let's see if we can get the audio from this machine. So this is what they actually sound like. It's actually a remarkably beautiful sound, right? It's maybe not a Stradivarius, but I'd venture to say these are probably just as valuable. Now, these were discovered in 1999, and more recently, even older flutes have been discovered. So these are actually from the Upper Paleolithic era, so 35 to 40,000 years ago, discovered in what is now the Danube Valley in Germany. And they're too broken up to be playable, but something that's really remarkable about these is that if you look at the distance between the holes of the flute, you can compute what the resulting pitches would be. They turn out to be pretty close to a diatonic scale. So music has really been around for a very long time, and this is very sophisticated technology to be able to take a bone and carve holes in it at a precise distance. And these are, these were cavemen, right? They're supposed to be barely able to survive trying to grab some food, and yet they made time to create these instruments, which means that it must have been incredibly important and powerful to them. And I won't really talk about the evolution of music, that's not really my theme, but as an entryway to this, I think what this is telling us is that music is essentially, we can go to the next slide, music is essentially part of our original mental machinery. Actually, if you can see my screen, then you can just follow what I'm doing. And I think it's interesting to consider what might be the reasons why music exists, even though that is not a question that I can actually answer as a neuroscientist. That's a question for an evolutionary biologist, perhaps. But I want to let you think about what some evolutionary biologists have said about this. And the most famous one, of course, is Darwin. And this is his most famous quote about music in The Descent of Man. He said, "As neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing musical notes are faculties of the least direct use to man, they must be ranked amongst the most mysterious with which he is endowed." So he basically threw up his hands and said, who knows, it's mysterious. There's no reason why music should exist. It does, but we can't explain it. But then there's this other statement that he made 10 years later in his autobiography, which is a very revealing statement. It's really a personal reflection. And he says as follows. First of all, he said, "If I had to live my life again, I would have made it a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every day. For perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use." Which is a remarkable insight, right? And then he said the following, "The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." Now this is in 1881, 10 years after he wrote that other statement, and I think here he answers maybe unwittingly, the question he posed 10 years earlier. Because the reason why music exists, I think what he's saying here, is that it has something to do with our emotional nature, with our ability to create and transmit emotions. And that's one of the themes that I want to explore today, is how is it that music creates this ability for emotional arousal? We heard it when we heard the musicians, we heard it from that flute. Music is able to communicate emotion and is able to, allows us to regulate both our own emotions and those of others. But how does it do this? How does music cause emotions? In particular, how does music cause pleasure? Music can cause many different emotions. I'm going to focus on pleasure today. It's difficult to think about how this might happen because, after all, music consists of a series of sounds. You put them together according to some set of rules, combinatorial rules, which allow you a lot of freedom, a lot of possibilities. But those elements, once they are put together into a musical pattern, have no specific denotation. Unlike, let's say, the patterns of speech, which I can put together, I can cause emotion in you by telling you a really sad story or a really happy story, but it's not the sounds themselves, it's the information that I'm conveying via those sounds. Music isn't really like that. It doesn't denote particular events as such. So it's a very curious phenomenon that it can cause pleasure, it can cause emotion. And my attempt at an explanation for this, I won't even call it an explanation, it's the beginning of a model maybe to understand it, goes along these lines. So I've got 3 points here, and this is basically the plan of the lecture today. First, I'm going to talk about the neural mechanisms that allow us to process music. So how is it that we can understand those individual sounds and how they're combined? Second, I'm going to talk about the neural mechanisms that have to do with pleasure and reward, independently from music. And then I'm going to argue that those two systems, which exist in our brains, actually interact in such a way that that is how we derive pleasure from music, and perhaps more generally aesthetic pleasure in other domains as well. So that's kind of the bottom line that I'm trying to suggest to you. So let's start with trying to understand some of the neural circuits that have to do with the perception and the production of music. And we just heard a wonderful violinist, and if we could peer into his brain, we would see something like this. We would see that there are a whole set of different brain regions that have to do with motor control, that have to do with creating those particular movements that make the music, but that also have to do with the perception of the music. And those two systems interact very strongly because the violinist will, of course, adjust the movements based on the sound that he's perceiving, but also the movements that he's making will create the sounds themselves. So it's kind of a loop. Now, I said if only we could look into the brain of the violinist as he's performing. Well, in fact, we can look into the brain, not of the violinist, but we haven't managed to get the violin, but we have managed to get a cello. So we have the world's only MRI-compatible optoacoustical cello. It's made out of fiber optic cables and resinous material, and it has gut strings, so it's historically authentic. And you know, gut is non-ferromagnetic, so you can put it inside the MRI scanner. Here you see on the right of the screen, you see top right, you see what it looks like. The bow is really, really short, so you know you cannot play the entire Dvorak concerto or anything, but you can play 3 or 4 notes. And on the bottom left, you actually see brain images of my student Melanie Sagado, who is a very good professional cellist as well as a neuroscience PhD student. So that's her brain, and the green areas show the areas that are active while we're playing. And here I have to acknowledge Avram Hollinger, who is an engineer who built this device for us, and Virginia Penning, who's actually here, who is supervising Melanie's research. So we can actually gain some insight into both the sensory and the motor aspects of playing an instrument. And if we have a little close-up here of the relevant regions, I'm going to focus really on 2 components here. So the area in green, that is in the temporal lobe, marked superior temporal gyrus, that is where the auditory cortex is found. And so those are the, that is where the neurons that respond to sound are located. And as you'll see, they are important for a great many functions that are absolutely essential for our ability to perceive music. And then the other regions, and particularly the premotor regions and the prefrontal regions, have a great deal to do with the motor control aspect. And the way that these two systems work together seems to be essential for the perception of music in various ways. Now, how do we know that these areas of the temporal cortex have anything to do with music? Well, we can actually go back to some research done a good 50 years ago now by the founder of our institute, Wilder Penfield, who was a neurosurgeon, founded the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he is famous for developing a technique whereby you could stimulate the cortex of epilepsy patients who were undergoing neurosurgery, and then they would report what they experienced. And in the bottom here, you see those red dots. Those are the areas which, when stimulated in some individuals, the person would report hearing music. So they would actually say, you know, I hear a song, or did someone turn on a radio? I hear music. So what this means is that when you pass a current through those particular regions, there must be information stored in those regions such that it is brought directly to the patient's mind. And so that means that that information is there, ready to be elicited, in this case, by the neurosurgeon's artificial electrical stimulation, but presumably it's also there for us to use when we want to. And I'll come back to that in a second. So you notice the distribution of those red dots is along the superior temporal cortex. So that indeed is where the auditory regions are located. And we can jump forward about 30 years now to some work that's 20 years old, one of the first neuroimaging studies that I actually did in my own laboratory. And the red dots that you see on those MRI scans, those represent areas of increased brain activity when people were perceiving these particular melodic patterns. Now, I'm not going to play these for you, 'cause these were actually composed especially by me for this experiment, and this is, you know, the first and last time that any of my compositions were published. This was in the Journal of Neuroscience. It's not, you know, not typically available for musicians, and it's just as well. But the point here is that the areas that are active in a normal human brain when people are perceiving these patterns of sound are very much overlapping with the areas that Penfield had identified as demonstrating activity when people were hearing music. Now, we can go a lot further with more modern techniques. This is a study from one of my PhD students, Mike Klein. And what we did here was we took patterns of sound that are extremely simple, but very well known to every musician. So if you hear this, these two notes, a little loud, but does anyone know what interval that is? Yes? What kind of a third? Very good. And what if you hear this one? Oh, that's also a minor third, but in the key of D, as opposed to the key of C. Here we have a major third. Right? So if you're a good musician, you can listen to each of these things and immediately tell what they are, regardless of what key they're in. And in this experiment, what we did was we looked at the brain regions which contained the information according to which you could decode these sounds. In other words, we play the sounds of the person, we then take the brain images, put them into a computational algorithm that tries to figure out what was that person listening to. And the areas where the computer is able to decode what those patterns are found in the temporal cortex. So what that means is that in that part of the brain, that person who is a highly trained musician, because this doesn't work if you're not a musician, that person's brain is figuring out what the sounds are, and the brain scan can then be used to kind of, you know, mind read or to look into that person's brain and say, oh, they must have been hearing a minor third at that point because the brain activity is actually doing that for us. What this also means is that it's not just that the this part of the auditory cortex is responding to sounds, but that it's also encoding the relationships between sounds. And I think any musician would know immediately that you cannot have music if you don't have relationships between sounds. All music is about not just one sound and then one other sound. It's about how the next sound relates to that first sound, and then how the sound after that relates to the second sound, and so forth. Now, there's something else that the auditory cortex does for us, which is that it is able to detect patterns of sound that are regular versus patterns of sound that are irregular. I'm going to illustrate what this means. I'm going to play something for you. And if you hear something strange or funny or wrong, I just want you to raise your hand immediately as soon as you hear it. Okay? So just listen to this little thing. Right, so there were two of them. Most of you got the second one, some of you got the first one. This is another one of my extraordinary compositions that it's on Spotify if you want to download it. So what we did in this experiment was we played, this is the correct version. So my question is, how could you tell that there were wrong notes in there? Because I'm sure you've never heard this. I'm positive, right? So how could you say, oh, that's a wrong note? Well, you can immediately do that because you haven't heard this, but you've heard hundreds, thousands, possibly millions of other tonal patterns that have similar relationships in them. And your brain has kept some kind of faithful record of all of that stuff that it's heard and figured out what are the regularities, so it knows what to expect. And when there's a deviation from that expected pattern, it immediately signals it, and that's why we got these big yellow blotches in the auditory cortex, because that part of the brain is going, hey, whoa, something's wrong. But what's interesting about that is that it's telling us that the auditory cortex is not merely responding when sounds come in some kind of slavish manner, it's actually anticipating what's coming. It's able to make a prediction about what's coming up. And that turns out to be very, very important, and I'll come back to that concept when we talk about musical pleasure. Now, we heard this beautiful piece by Beethoven. I believe the concerto was composed around 1806 or so. And as everyone knows, Beethoven went severely deaf. By the time he wrote this, he wasn't completely deaf, but he was definitely on his way. This is after he had written the Heiligenstadt Testament, where he was practically saying that he almost was ready to commit suicide because of his deafness. We know he was really deaf because if you go to the museum in Bonn, you will see these so-called conversation books that are shown in the upper right-hand corner. When people came to visit him, even if they shouted right in his ear, he could not understand what they were saying. So they had to write down their questions. So we know for sure that he was absolutely very deaf, and yet he was able to compose remarkable music. And so how could he do this? Well, clearly he was able to hear the music internally. He could imagine that music. This is what we call musical imagery, the ability to evoke sounds in your mind's ear. And we've done some experiments along these lines, not with Beethoven, because we can't get his brain, but we can get other people who have pretty well developed musical imagery. And what you see in this panel, in the orange, we see the areas of the brain that respond when you listen to real music. And again, that's the auditory cortex. It's those areas of the superior temporal gyrus that I showed you earlier. But in green, what we see are the areas which respond both to real sound and they respond in complete silence when the person is merely imagining the sound. And you can see there's quite a lot of green stuff there along the edges. And so what that's telling us is that when people are imagining sound, they're calling upon the auditory cortex to reconstruct, if you will, or to reinstantiate that musical sound. So in other words, those perceptual templates are stored in there, and you can call them to mind by an act of will, or if you're Penfield, you can call them to mind by putting an electrical current in your brain. I prefer the former method. So auditory cortex does a great deal for us. Also, I mentioned that the ability to control an instrument is something which requires different areas beyond the auditory cortex. And we can explore this in many different ways. One way that we have done this is to look at the specialization of the brain of highly trained musicians. And we have various techniques to do this. In one of these experiments done by one of my former students, Patrick Bermudez, we looked at the thickness of the cortex. So the cortex is the outer part of the brain, it's the gray matter. And with MRI, we can actually measure the thickness, like how many millimeters thick each little area is. And what we did was we compared highly trained musicians to regular people who had other skills, but not particularly musical skills. And the colored areas here represent not brain activity, but enhanced cortical thickness, so thicker cortex. And the areas that we see make a lot of sense. Auditory cortex, both sides. The motor cortex, mostly on the left side. There are some on the right as well, but this depends on the instrument you play. So particularly for string instruments, most of the action is, in fact, with the left hand, which is controlled from the right motor cortex. And a lot of these areas of the frontal cortex that have to do with the planning of actions and the anticipation of upcoming events. So this is evidence that the brain of a musician is highly specialized, and the parts that are specialized are areas that make sense in relation to what they're specialized to do, the control of their instrument. In a more recent study done by Chris Steele, who was a PhD student in Virginia Penhune's lab, what we looked at here was the white matter. So the gray matter is the outer part, the white matter is the inner part of the brain. It's basically the connections, it's basically the wiring between different brain regions. And this yellow sort of cable here represents the part of the brain that connects the two motor regions. So the motor region on the right and on the left are located about here, and there's a big fat cable that goes between them. And what was found in the study was that this white matter that interconnects the motor regions was more highly developed amongst musicians compared to non-musicians, but this was a function of the age at which they started. So I don't know if you can see that scatter plot there, but the earlier the age at which you began your musical training, the stronger this effect was. So if you began your training around ages 5, 6, 7, there's quite a large effect. It decreases by the time you get to about 15 or so. I'm not saying it's too late. That's about when I started to play music, which is why I'm a scientist and not a musician. So it's not the case that you cannot learn, but this plasticity, this ability to kind of mold brain structure is much harder to achieve. And what Chris showed in the study too was that the degree to which this white matter was enhanced was directly related to the ability of the musician to perform a synchronization task where they had to move their fingers in synchrony, which makes sense because it's the area that controls, that interconnects the two motor cortices. So I've told you about the auditory cortex and all its connections. It plays a large number of roles, all of which are essential for music. It enables us not only to encode sound features per se, but also the relationships between those sound features. It enables us to have this sensitivity to the regularity of music that we've experienced in the past, which in turn allows us to make predictions about what's coming up in the future. It enables the retrieval and the playout of this information that's been stored. That is related to this ability of imagery that we have. And these circuits are also enhanced with musical training, which is what enables a well-trained musician to perform beautiful music. But you might be wondering, what does this all have to do with pleasure? Because I promised you at the beginning I would talk about emotion and a particular aspect of emotion, which is pleasure. And none of this really relates to pleasure. So let's take a brief interlude here to talk about pleasure. And I have a couple of kind of historical points here. So various philosophers and thinkers throughout the ages have thought about music and pleasure. And I've only got a couple of them here in the interest of time. But here is St. Augustine. Now, I'm not sure of the appropriateness of quoting a Catholic saint in a synagogue, but here's what St. Augustine said. This is in his Confessions, volume 33. He had a lot to confess about. You know, he lived quite a healthy life and then towards the end sort of started to worry. So, but this is a very remarkable statement. He says the following. He's talking about singing in the context of religious ceremonies. He says, I fluctuate between the peril of pleasure and approved wholesomeness. I'm inclined to approve of the usage of singing in the church, that so, by the delight of the ears, the weaker minds may rise to the feeling of devotion. Yet, when it befalls me to be more moved with the voice than the words sung, I confess to have sinned penally, and then had rather not hear music. This, to me, is a remarkable insight. This is 4th century AD, right? So he totally gets it. He totally understands that music sometimes is so pleasurable that it takes you away from God, right? Because you're just enjoying the sensual aspect of music. And instead of listening to the words, which are supposed to be about praising the God or being part of the religious ceremony, you're instead just, enjoying the music. Now, if this guy was somewhat inappropriate, the next one is even more so. But his statement is rather interesting. So you all know this fellow, and he said as follows in 1971, music corrupts the minds of our youth. There is no difference between music and opium. Both create lethargy in different ways. He then went on to say that music should be banned. And of course, the Taliban actually took him up on this and attempted to ban music, although somewhat unsuccessfully. They also tried to ban kites, so I don't think that worked either. But what's interesting here, he doesn't quite have the right neurotransmitter system because he's talking about opioid system rather than dopamine, which is what you'll see in a second. But I think what's interesting here is that he considered music so dangerous, right, that it had to be banned or controlled. Because music has such power, people can derive such pleasure from it that they might not do the things that he would want them to do, right? Well, we know that music does cause a lot of pleasure. So here's a survey done with McGill University students. They were asked to endorse different things that give them pleasure. So 98% of them said romance, sex, success. Those are things everyone likes. Sun is way up there. If you've ever been to Montreal in November, sun is it's not like Aspen. And music is usually in the top 5 or 10, well above good grades, that doesn't surprise me, but well above food, well above money, and if there are jocks in the audience, it's much more pleasurable than sports, and if there are artists, it's even worse, news is even worse. People really get pleasure out of music much more often than with art. So certainly pleasure exists from music, and so this led us to think, well, if we want to understand it, what are the kinds of things that give people pleasure, and what is the neural basis thereof? What parts of the brain are really relevant for pleasure? Well, there are a lot of things that give people pleasure. Here are a few of them that are displayed here for your consideration. You shouldn't probably do all of these in one evening. 1 or 2 is maybe enough. Well, if you survive, yeah. So food, sexual activity, drugs, alcohol, these are various things which cause pleasure and are rewarding. And of course, some of them are necessary for survival. So food, obviously. Sex is necessary for the survival of the species, if not necessarily the individual. And then the other things are actually, the reason they're dangerous is precisely because they do cause a great deal of pleasure and they can become addictive. And when we look at the neural basis of this, all of these different stimuli have something in common, which is that they engage a totally different part of the brain than the one that we've been talking about so far. They engage these deep structures deep in the center of the brain, these gray matter nuclei that are not cortical, they're subcortical. And in particular, the caudate and the nucleus accumbens are the 2 structures of greatest interest. A great deal is known about these systems, a lot of it from animal research, some of it from addiction research. There's a vast literature on this, which I can't possibly even begin to cover. But one of the things that's clear is that the neurotransmitter that's involved in mediating these pleasurable responses is dopamine. Dopamine is the molecule which seems to be important in these particular structures. And there's this concept of what is called reward prediction error. This refers to the fact that you get the biggest dopamine boost when, let's say, an animal is performing a task. It usually gets a certain amount of food, and then all of a sudden on a given trial it gets a lot more food than it was anticipating, and then you get a huge upregulation of dopamine. Whereas if it gets less food than it usually gets, then you get an inhibition of dopamine. We know from brain imaging experiments that this structure that we call the striatum, so it's a little confusing because you see there the, sorry, can we go back one? The caudate and the nucleus accumbens are collectively known as the striatum. Neuroscientists like to give extra complicated names to things just to make life confusing for those students coming in. So the caudate and the nucleus accumbens together are the striatum. They're also referred to as the dorsal and ventral striatum, just to make things even more complicated. But if we go back, so when we look at neuroimaging experiments, we see that the striatum is in fact active in healthy humans when they receive either money during some kind of a gambling task, or when they receive food, or they're looking at pictures of food when they're really hungry, or in the case of erotic rewards, they're actually viewing erotic stimuli. And in all of these cases, you see those yellow blotches that are circled. You get a very consistent pattern of a response in that region. So when we saw these kinds of studies a few years ago, we thought to ourselves, well, could it be that music, although it is not a substance, it's not a chemical like a drug, nor is it a biologically rewarding stimulus that is necessary for survival, strictly speaking, like food is. You will die if you don't get food. You will not die if you don't get music. You may be really, really unhappy, but it won't literally kill you. So we wondered, could it be that music, although it's an abstract stimulus, would still engage the same system? And I wouldn't be telling you this whole story if the answer weren't yes. But before we could study it, we had to figure out, well, how are we going to do this? Because, you know, musical pleasure is very idiosyncratic. People aren't always consistent in their responses. So one of my former students, Anne Blood, came up with the idea of studying musical chills. So it's also called frisson, or chills down the spine, or goosebumps. How many of you know what I'm talking about? It's really pretty common to music. What's beautiful about it is that when it happens, we know that it happens because we can actually measure it with physiological measures, and it's highly reproducible. So it means that we can put someone in a scanner and we know exactly when the highest pleasure will occur, and we can then look at the brain activity during that moment. To do this experiment, however, we couldn't give the listener the music. The listener had to give us the music because of this very individualized preference that people have. Different people like different kinds of music. And I just want to play you a couple of examples just so you can see the different kinds of music that people liked. So this one you'll probably is not so controversial. I think you'll agree that that's fairly pleasurable. Sorry. How about this one? You're allowed to plug your ears. Okay, that is absolutely horrendous, but one of our listeners brought it in, some kind of techno music, and said that she got chills every time she heard it. You might get, some other response, like a fear response, and you want to go running from the room. Here's another one that one person brought in. That's kind of nice, cool jazz. And then this one I find very puzzling as well. All right, enough of that. Are there any Scotsmen in the audience? You're probably the only person who liked that. The point here is that musical tastes and preferences are really quite individual. And there's nothing, people often ask me, well, what's the magic ingredient of music that makes it pleasurable? Well, there isn't one. If there were, I would be a very rich person. But the point is that it interacts with your own background, your own knowledge. This comes back to this idea of the templates that are stored in your mind from having heard music. If you grew up in Scotland, you have different templates than if you grew up in Argentina like I did. So I like tango, you like bagpipes. So we had each person bring in the music that they liked, and we had them signal to us when they were experiencing chills. And when we look at their brain, sure enough, we see that there is a response in this structure that is also active to other kinds of stimuli like food reward or even erotic images. And in this particular study that was done by Valerie Salampur, one of my former PhD students, we actually used a different imaging technique that allows us to look directly at dopaminergic activity. So we actually use a radioactive tracer that binds to the dopamine receptors. And so what you're seeing in the image here is not just general brain activity, it's specifically dopamine activity. Now you'll notice that there's two sort of blobs, one further north, one further south. And that turns out to be extremely interesting because when we do further analysis with these data, we find that those two structures are active at different times. So if you look at the graph on the bottom, and I'm sorry if you can't quite read it, the contrast isn't so good, but what we've done is we've looked at the time course of the brain activity in those two structures as a function of when the chill occurred. So the chill is marked with the arrow, and prior to the chill, for about 15 seconds or so, the greatest activity is found in the dorsal striatum. So that's the one that's marked anticipation. And then, when the chill occurs, which is the peak pleasure moment that people tell us, and that's when their physiology goes off the chart, then that first structure tends to go down, and then the ventral striatum is the one that goes up. And that's the actual experience of pleasure. That's the maximum, moment when you're going, that's so beautiful. And this is really interesting because it means that this response in the striatum actually has two phases that correspond to two different components of what you are experiencing. The first part is when you're anticipating what's coming up. And then the second part is when you actually get the full pleasure. And this idea that there are two different pathways that have two different time signatures, if you will, no pun intended, turns out to be very concordant with other information. So when we talk to neuroanatomists and we ask them, well, there's this difference in these two structures, the dorsal and the ventral striatum. Why might there be such a difference? They will tell us, well, the dorsal striatum is connected to parts of the brain that are more phylogenetically advanced, particularly in the frontal cortex, also the cingulate cortex. And these are areas that have to do with what? Prediction, anticipation, planning, decision-making, evaluation of different outcomes. These are all like the higher order aspects of the human brain that are most highly developed in the frontal cortex. So it's more cognitive, in quotes. Whereas the ventral striatum is connected to a totally different set of structures, including the amygdala, the ventromedial frontal cortex, brainstem nuclei, a whole bunch of other structures, which have to do more with what might be called affect, so the actual experience of emotion, as opposed to the more cognitive representations. So the fact that those two structures have these two different functions in our results, and that they have these different pathways, really makes sense in that regard. But to me, the most interesting thing is that when we talked about this idea of the anticipation and the pleasure and so on to music theorists, they said, well, haven't you read Mayer's 1956 treatise called Emotion in Music, right? So this is a model that's been out there for a while, and David Huron, who's a musicologist at Ohio State, has recently written a very nice book called Sweet Anticipation, which I highly recommend to you. And what the bottom line of this model is that musical emotions arise from the fulfillment or the suspension of musical expectancies. So, according to Meyer, when you listen to music, you have predictions that are developed, and there is this concept of tension and resolution. This is a very common concept that all musicians can understand. And composers and performers understand this either implicitly or explicitly if they've read some of this theoretical work, and they can exploit this concept by creating tension in different ways and by sometimes fooling you, so what you anticipate is not exactly what you get. And the reason I chose for the end of the program this intermezzo by Brahms is because I think it's a particularly good example of this idea of creating harmonic tension and resolution. So as you listen to this piece, I've only got the first few bars here, you will immediately notice that you start off in a very restful A minor, and then you move to, a slightly more distant chord, then you move back to A minor. And then at some point, actually, in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in the 6th bar, you have this F sharp minor chord. And I'm not a music theorist, so I don't know what that's doing there, because I guess it's the 2 chord of the relative 5? I don't know. It's a distant chord. It's the relative minor of the parallel major. Why didn't I see that? But it's a distant chord that needs resolution, right? And then he does resolve it. And this music is full of this. It's like every few measures, you have this buildup of tension, and then it's resolved. And sometimes what you expect is not exactly what you get, and that's what makes Brahms so great. So I just want to tell you one last thing, if I have one more minute. So, I've argued that this structure deep in the brain is what's responsible for our emotions. But I've also argued that there's all this cortical system that does all the hard work, right? So what's the link between them? And we have one last experiment that I think shows what this link is. This is another study by my former student, Valerie Salimpour. What we did in this experiment was actually, we used quite a different approach, a so-called neuroeconomics approach. We had people listen to music, short excerpts, like you listen to on iTunes, and you have to decide whether you would buy it or not. And then we looked at the amount of money that people were willing to spend as an index of how much they wanted to have that music, right? This is a very straightforward thing. The monetary value, it's a very good quantitative estimate of how much you actually want that. When we use that dollar value and look at the brain data, we see that our old friend in the yellow there, the striatum, is indeed the structure whose activity scales with the amount of money that you're willing to spend. So that's very consistent with what we saw before. The more you want it, the more the striatum is active and telling you, oh, wow, that's so great, I want it. But the real interesting thing here is that we then looked at how this structure relates to the rest of the brain. And what we found was that the crosstalk between this structure and the cortex, in particular the auditory cortex, is much stronger when the piece of music is highly valued compared to when the piece of music is not highly valued. So this means that those parts of the brain that have to do with the perceptual aspects, the decoding of the sound, the understanding of those sound relationships, that's what is going back and forth to the deeper structures which have to do with pleasure and reward. And so my final slide here is just to say that, I talked about these 2 different systems. The first one is the cortical-based system. That's the one that does all the heavy lifting with respect to the incoming sound and also the production of sound and creating it's what allows us to have the ability to understand these relationships between different musical elements. And that system interacts with, and this is a very recent system, by the way, phylogenetically speaking. It's really essentially only highly developed in humans and not even very much in our close relatives, the great apes. Whereas the deeper structures, which are the reward structures, are actually phylogenetically preserved across many different species. So if you look at the reward system of a rat, it doesn't look that different from ours. And so music, remarkably, I think, is a mechanism by which we humans have learned to maybe enhance, maybe regulate our emotion, our arousal, our reward system, because we can use our cortical system to interact with it. So it's this remarkable interplay between the newest parts of our brain that do the most intelligent things with the oldest part of our brains that have to do most with, you know, our deepest emotions. And I think that's why music is as powerful as it is. And so I just want to end by thanking all the students who've done all the work. They're really the ones that stay in the lab and do all the work. I just get to visit beautiful places like Aspen and give nice lectures. This is Valerie Salampour, who did all the work in the last that I mentioned. And my collaborators and the various Canadian government agencies that have supported this research very generously. And also you for listening very generously. Thank you.
So now we're going to have a brief performance, Brahms' Opus 116 No. 2, which is the piece that Dr. Zatori was just showing us. This is pianist Peng Lin, and after that is when we will have questions. Terrific. So if there are questions or comments, I will start right here, and I'm going to repeat the question or comment, so make them very simple for me. What are the practical or perhaps medical implications of the research Dr. Zatori has been talking about?
Yes, thank you for that question. So, of course, what we try to do is really understand the basics of the system. We're trying to understand, in the way I look at it is, our job is to understand how the brain works, and music is a remarkable way to unlock some of those mysteries. And the more we understand the functionality of the brain, the more we'll be able to make progress in terms of therapeutic interventions. That's a general answer. A more specific answer is, of course, that there's a great deal of interest in using music in various therapeutic settings. And you know, there's a well-established specialty of music therapy where people try to use music. And when I've spoken to people who work in that domain, oftentimes they say to me, well, we don't quite understand the underlying principles by which it might or might not work, or how reproducible it is, or things like that. So my point of view is that, you know, if we do the right science, we'll have the understanding that will then allow us to do more of this direct intervention. As an example, I can tell you one of our recent PhD students who actually did a lot of the work on the sensory motor aspect, the integration of the motor cortex with the sensory cortex. She now has a position at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, which is a big research hospital, and she's working with patients who have motor stroke to try to enhance their movement by giving them auditory feedback. And that's directly based on the idea that when you play a musical instrument, that is what you're doing. You're creating a movement, but you're getting the auditory feedback, and the auditory feedback facilitates the movement, and it's this kind of closed loop. So that's sort of, you know, one example among many that I could cite.
Right here.
I think a lot of us have heard the theory that people who are mathematically inclined or good at math are very often good musicians. I wonder if your research has indicated whether this is true or not, and if so, why?
So the question is about the possible connection between mathematical ability and musical ability, and is there a reason in the structure of the brain to think that there is such a connection?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question. I think a lot of that is kind of anecdotal, so it's not really based on any very clear-cut experimental work that I know of. That doesn't mean it's not there. It just hasn't really been established. Now, you can make the argument that there are some structures in the brain. There's one that I didn't talk about, but it was on my diagram of the circuit. So there's a structure up here in the parietal cortex, which is known to be very important for mathematical processing. There's a guy in France who's done a lot of work on this, Stanislas Dehaene. Actually, he wrote a great book on math. And Dehaene says, well, the reason, or the functionality of this part of the brain has to do with transformations of one type of pattern to another. And that's what you do when you do math, right? You operate on some set of numbers. What we found in our research is that that same structure is important when, for example, you have to recognize a tune that's in a different key from the one that you heard it in. And our argument is that that's a similar kind of operation. You take one pattern, you transform it into a different set of sequences, but you recognize a similarity, just like you recognize that 5 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 5. So that might be a basis for some link between the two domains. But as to whether, like, you know, really extraordinary musical ability and extraordinary math ability go together, I actually don't know of any strong evidence to support it.
Okay, Fred?
I'm an aging piano student, and I had a teacher who told this story. She had a brother who was a neurophysiologist, which I can't spell. But they both took musical instruments as children, and he told them true, or did she just want me to take more piano lessons?
So the question is, that's a long one, Fred. The question is there evidence that being a practicing musician makes you less likely to get Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so this is somewhat related to the other question about, how this research might help. So I don't think we know the answer to that question. This will be the answer I give to every question, so don't be too frustrated. It's what scientists always say, right? We need more research, and you need to give us more funding so we can do more research. I don't know really about whether there is very good evidence that that the incidence of Alzheimer's is lower. I don't believe so. There is some evidence, and it's not very strong, but it's interesting. It's sufficient to follow up, which suggests that there might be some preservation of function for a longer time in someone who has the right training. And then the question is, well, which functions? And that's where the detail comes in. So one function for which there does seem to be pretty good evidence, but it's not really related to Alzheimer's, but I'll mention it anyway because it's really pretty well established, and it's not that surprising, is that musicians as they age are better able to perceive sounds in noisy backgrounds than people without musical training. And it's not just musical sounds, it's any sounds. So in particular speech, for instance, if you're in a crowded environment, as you and I probably have experienced, it becomes harder to understand that speech. But if you're musically trained, the degree to which you'll experience that problem is less so than that of other people. Now that's not really related to Alzheimer's, but it's one function that's really clearly established. And that gives us at least reason to think that there might be other functions that are also maybe better maintained, including things like memory, including things like the motor skills, and so on and so forth. So it's a very active area of research, in fact. People think that there's something to it, which is why they're investing resources into it. I don't think the final answer will be, that it somehow prevents Alzheimer's. I doubt that very much. But I do think that it could be something that is worth exploring in terms of preservation of function.
Okay, we're going to go way in the back. So the question is whether there's a difference in the neurotransmitters like dopamine between listening or making music.
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. It's one of the reasons we did the insane thing of building a musical instrument that could be played inside a magnetic resonance scanner, because we're interested in that very question as well. I don't believe anyone's actually done any studies to look at that. We do know that if you look at at musicians' self-report, they do report experiencing a lot of pleasure when they perform music. However, it depends a great deal on the circumstances under which they're playing, because as any professional musician in this room would know, performing can also be highly anxiety-provoking. So you might have a push and a pull. You might have the pleasure produced by the music, but then it's being inhibited by the anxiety of performing. So it's, fairly complicated. The other aspect, which I think is extremely interesting to explore, and I just got a research grant last week to look at this, is the idea that the dopamine system not only is related to pleasure, it's also related to what neuroscientists call plasticity. So the ability of, one's ability to learn, essentially, which makes perfect sense, because if you're getting a reward and you made some kind of action to obtain that reward, then you want to make that action again, right? Because it's rewarding. So you want to learn how to make that action. So what we want to do is look at this in the context of learning to play a piece of music, that when you play it correctly, it should be rewarding to play it correctly, which in turn should actually help you get that motor program more stabilized than if you play it incorrectly. So we're going to do this by doing a horrible experiment where we get people to make the correct movements on the instrument, but we either play them the correct notes or the incorrect notes. Even though they've made the right movement, they'll get the wrong notes. And we'll see if this messes up their learning, which I expect it will.
Okay, right here. So the question is, people who have lost the ability to create new memories, new long-term memories, does this affect their ability to hear new music?
Right. So people who have developed true amnesia, which is what you are describing, whether it be due to any of a number of possible causes, those people typically cannot form new memories of any kind in any modality. So whether it be music or text that they've read or faces that they've viewed or events that they've experienced or food that they tasted, they won't be able to form new memories at all. However, there is some, again, scanty evidence, but intriguing, that in some people who have memory disorders, some things seem to remain. So the ability to recognize musical patterns in some individuals seems to be better retained than other memories. So this is not the ability to form new memories, but rather the ability to retrieve old ones. It's quite variable from person to person is the problem. So, you can go on YouTube and find any number of reports or videos of old people who suddenly, when they hear music that they heard in their youth, find it very wonderful. But you can also find people with dementia who will not respond. And one of the really intriguing questions is what's different in those individuals? What's going on in their brains? So again, I come back to this idea that our goal is to try to do the best research we can so that then we have the tools to be able to address those questions. Because if you don't do this kind of research, then you don't know how to go about it. That's my point of view, is that we can develop the techniques. And in my laboratory, what we do is we develop the techniques, then I train the students to learn how to implement those techniques, and then they go off and they do that kind of research. That's kind of the global plan for domination.
I'm going to go right here.
Do you do any research on that phenomenon? Maybe somebody might have like a slight brain injury, had no musical talent their entire life, and suddenly they could be on, Carnegie Music Hall, that they just acquire this amazing ability to play the piano or to play the violin. There was a show recently on PBS about that. It was just fascinating. And I don't know if you do any research on that or...
The question is about when a traumatic brain injury leads to someone having a suddenly greatly increased musical ability or an ability that they had never had before.
Yeah, I have never done any research on that, and I've never seen such a case. My native skepticism would kick in here. I would like to see it for myself before I believe it. I find it fanciful to think that, someone who's, like our musicians have trained for 20 years, that can be achieved by a bump in the head. I don't buy it. There is, however, evidence that some brain lesions, in particular to the left frontal cortex, can result in certain kinds of disinhibition. And what may be going on in those cases, and I don't know them, so I can't speak directly to them, but what might be going on is that one might have a person who actually did have some training, but never wanted to demonstrate it. And then following the damage, what that does is actually remove some of the inhibitions, allowing them to try things out that they wouldn't otherwise have tried out. And that phenomenon, I think, is true. But
So I have to repeat the old joke. Let's say someone is going in for rotator cuff surgery and says, "Doctor, after the surgery, will I be able to play the violin?" And the doctor says, "Absolutely yes." And the person says, "I've always wanted to." Okay, right there. So the question is, these areas of the brain that are clearly important for music, what else do they do?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Thank you for that. Because I think that there are circuits in the brain that really are essential for music, but I don't subscribe to the idea that there's like, a dedicated music module that does nothing else. And this is an idea that was maybe current 30 or 40 years ago, but I think most neuroscientists have come around to a different idea, which is that each particular area of the brain does some computation, and then depending on what other areas it connects with, that will lead to some kind of complex function. So for instance, I give the example of the parietal cortex, which is important both for mathematical reasoning, but also for transposing one tune to another. The reason is that both of those operations actually require the same kind of underlying computation. So if you were programming a computer to do that, the algorithm that would do that would actually be very similar. So that part of the brain doesn't do mathematics, it doesn't do music. What it does is it takes patterns, whether they be visual or auditory or some other domain, and figures out how they get transformed from one form to a different form. Similarly, the auditory cortex, some of the areas I talked about are essential for the perception of pitch. Without pitch, you could have music. There are some styles of music that are primarily rhythmic, but there's a lot of music that you would not be able to perceive. But that doesn't mean that it's specialized only for music, because that same region will respond to the pitch in the voice, for example, even when it's just a spoken voice and not a sung voice. So each area has a specialization. When those areas combine with other areas, they allow us to have these complex functions that we might call music, we might call it speech, we might call it spatial navigation, we might call it long-term memory. But in and of themselves, there's not enough brain to cover all the different abilities that we have. So the brain is actually an incredibly flexible structure, and because it can combine the different sub-elements in different ways, depending on the requirement, it is able to, continuously come up with new solutions to problems.
With the cerebellum, the overlooked portion of the circuitry that has to do with coordination, the internal metronome in different ways, I noticed that you didn't have that in your circuitry, either production or reception.
So the question is about the cerebellum and why that seemed not to be included in the diagrams.
I rely on my wife for the cerebellum. She's the expert, and she's sitting next to you there, so you can ask her. She's the cerebellar expert. So it's her favorite brain structure, and we always argue about why do I leave it out of my slides, and she's like, you should make it really big. So it plays an enormous role, particularly in motor function, but not only in motor function. It actually plays a role in many different cognitive functions. And Virginia will correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a particular importance in the learning of motor patterns. So when you are becoming an expert, there are actually several different systems that are involved in motor learning. There's the cortical system, there's the basal ganglia, and there's cerebellum. And they each come online at different time points, depending on the stage of learning that you're at. Because early in learning, you're still trying to figure out the correct movements. Later in learning, you want those movements to be really consolidated so that they'll be very stable and not subject to perturbation. I always forget where the cerebellum comes in the different stages of learning, but she can tell you.
Okay, now we need to get Dr. Zatori to have a neurotransmission of reward pleasure vis-a-vis dinner. But I thought I would just take Mike for one more question.
Could you say a bit more about the possible evolutionary advantage of
So the question is about the possible evolutionary advantage conveyed by music.
Yeah, well, you know, I am not an evolutionary biologist or psychologist, so I always tread very carefully on that. But it seems to me, well, let me give you the answer that a good friend and colleague of mine, Ani Patel, has given. Ani is a professor at Tufts, and he wrote a very nice book on music and speech in the brain. And his argument goes something like this. He says, well, you don't need to assume or propose that music was selected for in the way that, let's say, bipedal locomotion was selected for. So we have an adaptation, our feet are adapted so that we can walk, and that's incredibly useful, and then it frees our hands to do other things. What he says is music is more like a technology. It's more like an ability that we have by virtue of other abilities. So we have all the circuitry that I described. It's able to make sense of sound that's coming in. It's able to encode different patterns. It's able to make predictions about what's coming up. All of that stuff is there, probably not because it was necessary for music. It's because it's incredibly useful to have that if you're going to survive in the environment. You're hearing all kinds of sounds. Some might be predators, some might be prey, some might be indicative that, you know, a storm is coming, whatever it is. And music can build on that. And what Ani Patel suggests is, he says, but that, you know, on the one hand, you don't have to assume that it is selected for. On the other hand, you don't have to go to the other extreme, the way that Steve Pinker does, and dismiss it and say, well, it's useless. Because having discovered it, even though it wasn't selected for, it turns out to be extremely useful. And he gives the analogy of fire. So early humans had the ability to figure out how to control fire. There was nothing in evolution that specifically selected people to be able to make or control fire. What was selected for was the ability to have vision so that you could see what fire was, to have cognition to be able to figure out, oh, every time there's a lightning strike, I smell smoke and I see fire, and to have the motor control that allows you to rub together the sticks. All of that stuff developed separately. But once you have the ability to control fire, it's immensely useful because you can use it to cook your food, you can use it to ward away intruders, etc. Similarly with music, all these abilities that we have probably evolved for different reasons. But once you put them together into this thing called music, we can do things like lull our baby to sleep, or sing a love song to our lover, or get together with our other tribe members and scare away the other guys who are going to attack us, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of very important abilities, in particular, as I said at the beginning, in relation to regulation of mood states and emotional states. So it's a long-winded answer, but I hope you got it.
Thank you. I think that is a great place to stop for the day, but many thanks to you for coming and to Dr. Robert Satori for being with us.